Hello, this is my first video of going over the AP Biology course for 2023, so this may be outdated in a little bit. This first video is on the context for this isn't actually any of the content that is tested on the exam, but it is the context for basically every concept on the exam. Everything related to biochemistry will benefit from this video. Anyways, the first concept in the context for this course, which I've labeled Basics of Chemistry, and that is essentially just to this is essentially just to prep us for the next unit, which is about biochemistry. So first off, what is matter? And matter consists of any pure substance, and it's made of compounds or compounds/molecules or atoms, and it has a mass. But really what matter is it's anything with a mass or a volume. It's important to note how light has a mass but does not take up space. Therefore, it isn't considered matter. Anyways, matters, as I mentioned before, matter is built up of molecules and atoms, and I think it's important to get started with what is an atom. And an atom is essentially the smallest unit of matter with its own unique properties, as in it has its own unique melting point and its own color and texture and look. It is like it's the smallest unit of matter that has its own unique properties. What are atoms made of, you may ask? They are made of building blocks called subatomic particles, and there are many of them, but the three that we need to focus on for this course is the proton, which it has a charge of 1. It has a positive charge, which we will get into in a minute. And for the sake of this video, I will label it with a red dot because it makes it easy. We have an electron, which has a negative charge of 1, and it will be labeled with a blue dot for simplicity, and it has a negative charge. And the electron, it's important to note, though not that important, that the electron is a lot smaller than a proton is. And then finally, we have a neutron, which has no charge. And these are, or a neutral charge, as the name implies. And for simplicity's sake, we will be using a gray dot. The essential fundamental forces of nature. Only one of them is incredibly important, but I'll mention another because it's interesting. The first one is the electromagnetic force. And this basically states that almost everything in the universe, all at least subatomic particles, are made up of positive and negative charges. And it basically states that opposites attract and like charges repel each other. As in, a positive and a positive charge will repel each other. A negative and a negative charge will repel each other. But two opposite charges, such as a positive and a negative charge, will attract to each other. The second fundamental force of nature that's important, although not as important, at least for this course, is the strong nuclear force, which essentially states that protons and neutrons have an attraction to each other. And this is important because, as when we'll discuss in a second, the structure of an atom, and it has a nucleus, and this is essentially what allows the nucleus to be held together. There's also the weak nuclear force, and gravity. I assume you guys know what gravity is, and the weak neutral force isn't essential to know about for this course. Here let's discuss the structure of an atom, which is important for understanding the basics of chemistry and biology. Each atom is characterized by the amount of protons they contain. So if you look at a periodic table and it has a certain number, this is essentially why. Each atom is characterized by the amount of protons it has, and that essentially determines what properties it has based on the proton number. One example is hydrogen, which has 1 proton, 1 neutron, and 1 electron. And right here is where I would like to discuss the structure of an atom, which is made of a nucleus, which is at the very center of the atom, where it's very dense, where all the protons and the neutrons are essentially lie. And there's electrons basically orbiting the outside, like this constantly, and they move incredibly quickly around the nucleus. And this is the basis of an atom. Here is a slightly more complex, although far from the most complex atom. Oxygen, which has 8 protons in the center and 8 neutrons, usually, in the center. And it has 8 electrons. In general, although not always by any means, the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons are the same, theoretically. But I would like to mention right now that this isn't always true. There are things called isotopes, which is when there is a different number of neutrons in the center. Keep in mind, it cannot be a different number of protons because that would change the type of element that it is. Only neutrons can have a variable amount, and electrons can as well, depending on the element. And anyways, there are two wants of an atom, and I use the word want carefully because atoms don't really want anything necessarily. It's not living. It doesn't have desires. But for the sake of simplicity, I'll use the word want. But atoms want electrons and shells. It's important to note, and I've drawn it in this diagram, that there are different energy levels that electrons can orbit in. The ones farther out from the nucleus have more energy, and when they lose energy, they'll drop down to a lower orbit. But electrons can only orbit in shells, and which are the distinct quantitative different energy levels. And it isn't a continuous spectrum. There's quantified amounts of energy that cause different levels that electrons have to have. So the first level can only contain 2 electrons around it, and you can see the 2 modeled out here and here, and they're constantly floating around on the innermost shell. And then on the outside, we have 6 more electrons on the outermost shell that are constantly orbiting around. And they have a quantified amount of energy, in which it must be that amount for that respective shell. The first shell of any atom wants to be filled with 2 electrons, just 2. And then the shells outside that want to be consequently outside that want to be filled with 8 electrons. And basically the other the caveat is that atoms want to be either have fully filled shells or fully empty shells to be the most stable form it can, or else it wants to get rid of or add electrons to the atom in order to get the most stable it can be, which is when it has complete full shells or complete empty shells. In the case of oxygen, because it has 2 in the inner level, which makes it complete, and the atom likes that. Although I would like to remind you, it doesn't like that. It just is the most stable that way. And then it has 6 on the outside, which means oxygen would like to pick up 2 more electrons that come in on the outside to make it a complete shell. But I will discuss what this means in context in a minute. The other want is that atoms want to have an equal number of protons and neutrons. And this basically is, this doesn't often happen because if we think about the strong nuclear force, the nucleus of the atom is being held together because neutrons and protons attract each other. But protons have positive charges in every proton. So theoretically, these would want to repel away from each other constantly. And it's the strong nuclear force that holds protons to neutrons that keeps it together. So when we get to bigger atoms that have more protons, we need more and more neutrons so that we can hold so that strong force is stronger than the electromagnetic force trying to repel the protons from each other. I'd also like to mention how the whole atom stays together. The reason why electrons orbit around the protons is because of this electromagnetic force that keeps the electrons and the protons attracted to each other. The next thing is compounds, also known as molecules, which are when multiple atoms bind to form a new substance that has its own unique properties. Stress on that it has its own unique properties because this is very important for life. And this happens basically through bonding. And bonding is very important. And there's a couple crucial bonds that we need to know for this course. The first of which is a covalent bond, which is when two atoms share a pair of electrons. And this is one very important example that you need to know for this is H2O, also known as water, which is essentially one oxygen followed by two H molecules. And right here, these lines indicate covalent bonds. This is what it looks like in actuality, with these green shells also representing electrons just from these hydrogens, and this oxygen in the center. And basically, this shows two hydrogens attached to one oxygen. And because of they share this pair of electrons right here and right here, they will basically attach to each other. And this is probably the strongest bond. This is the most permanent of all the ones that we'll know. And without some external force, which we'll learn about in future units, this doesn't, or an incredible amount of energy, this won't separate on its own. The next one is an ionic bond, which is when two or more ions, which are charged molecules / atoms, bind due to their attraction to each other. And this happens in a process that I have written out here. And I think it's best to learn through example, which is why I will use the example of NaCl, sodium chloride, which is salt. It's the chemical equation for salt. And this happens essentially when one molecule, in this case, this is a sodium ion, and in this case over here is a chloride ion, or it's a chlorine. Essentially what happens is the sodium ion has 11 protons in the middle, but it has because it has two full rings, or sorry, it doesn't have two full rings. It has 11 electrons around here. So because it's trying to theoretically match the 11 protons in the middle, but if we recall from up here, these atoms want to have complete shells of either 2 for the first one or 8 for all the next ones. And because it has 11 electrons, it wants to reduce it down to 10 so that it has an inner ring of 2 and an outer ring of 8. So what will happen is this molecule will essentially, will give over its electron to the chloride ion, which has 17 protons and 17 electrons. So this wants to pick up an electron because then it will have an inner layer of 2, an outer layer of 8, and then another layer of 8. So it has complete shells. And anyways, so this is what happens. It works out perfectly that as this donates one electron to the other one, they both will complete, or empty in this case, and complete their shells. And they will be the most stable form they can be. But the consequence of this is that the sodium will have a positive charge because it'll now have 11 protons but 10 electrons. And this chloride ion will have 11 electrons but 17 protons. So this will have a net charge of -1, and this will have a net charge of +1, which causes, because opposite charges attract, they will want to attract. And that forms what is known as NaCl. Hello, I'm back. Past me explained this very poorly and very stupidly, so I'm going to explain it better. Current me is going to explain it better. Essentially, what happens in hydrogen bonding is the idea that oxygen by default is a neutral molecule. It has 8 electrons by default and 8 protons. So when it covalently bonds to, but it has, remember, if we go back to up here, oxygen has only 6 electrons in its shell, and it wants 2 more so that it can have a complete shell of 8. And that is the most stable for oxygen, so it wants that. Going back down here. So what will happen is when it bonds to the hydrogen will basically donate, not really though, a better way of phrasing it is that the oxygen, because it's greedy, is stealing the electron that is orbiting around each of the hydrogen molecules, so it may spend a little bit of time orbiting the hydrogen, and then it'll go spend a longer amount of time orbiting the oxygen. And what this does is, and keep in mind, multiple electrons are doing this. Both of the electrons on the hydrogen molecules are doing this with the oxygen. And what the consequence of this is essentially that the oxygen will part of the time have a negative charge because it'll have extra electrons floating around it. It'll have its normal 8 electrons floating around it, but it'll have 2 more that are part of the time floating around the oxygen to complete its shell, but it only has 8 protons. Therefore, it'll have a partially negative charge because it'll have more electrons than protons temporarily. And because the electron is going away from the hydrogen will have a partially positive charge because it'll have 1 less electron floating around it, which leaves it with part of the time having 1 proton and part of the time, which will make it partially positive. And a hydrogen bond is essentially between 2 different molecules of water, where the positively charged H molecule will have an attraction to the partially negatively charged oxygen molecule, and this is what creates a hydrogen bond. And I will talk about this in the next videos, but this has many implications, beneficial implications for life.